It's an absolutely devastating time. I mean, we see 2 million people die. 36 million people more are hounded, either for supposed political crimes, sometimes just really accidents of birth. They were perhaps born into a landlord's family. You've actually seen more devastating moments in China if you just count the death toll. But I think what's really staggering about the Cultural Revolution is that it ripples out across the whole country and it affects everybody. And it's felt at the most intimate level as well. So it begins as an emperor's reassertion of power. Mao is worried about his position following the Great Leap Forward. He launched this attempt to industrialise and collectivise the economy, but it was just so insanely sort of hubristic that it ends in complete disaster.
And it's in every classroom and every bedroom and every breakfast table by the end of it, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, tens of millions of people die in the Great Leap Forward. He's worried about his position, he's worried about his legacy, and he sets out to eradicate any form of opposition within the party. But he does this critically by bringing in the masses, by using this mass sentiment. There's already a personality cult that's built up around him. You know, Mao is the red sun in our hearts. He's there everywhere. I mean, you wake up in the morning, he's on the pillows, he's on your mirror. He uses this extraordinary veneration in which he's held and he wields it against the party. And so both of his heirs apparent will die before the decade is out. But because it's carried out through the people, it ripples out and we see farmers dying. We see not just revered scholars and artists dying, but infants, even in some cases, being killed because of their sort of class background. As horrific as that is. And so it's the intimate treacheries, I think, that play out that are often really sort of the most devastating people. It's when husbands are turning on wives. It's when colleagues and friends are sort of turning upon each other. Sort of households really ripped apart by this. And that, in some ways, is, I think, what people find it hardest to move past. And also, because it sort of moves at such dizzying speed, it's hard to keep up with. And this is an ideological crusade for Mao as well. He wants to purify the nation, purifies its hearts and souls, make these people into the sort of the real communists he believes they should be. And as this ripples out, we just sort of see these extraordinary levels of fervour that are impossible for us to understand. I mean, things like police at one point directing traffic with copies of the Little Red Book rather than batons because only Mao's words can show you where to go. It's a level of absurdity and horror combined that is really sort of hard for us to imagine, I think.
It's a kind of religious fanaticism, isn't it?
It really is, yes. And it begins, Mao uses as his shock troops, not just the people, but specifically young people and children. We're talking very young teenagers, some sort of 13 or 14. We see these sort of political vigilante groups forming, Red Guards who sweep through the cities and tear down temples, but also are beating and murdering teachers and scholars and artists and so forth. It's just a horrific moment. And then as it ripples out, we see factional fighting between them. And even when that initial wave of Red Guard violence is over, then we go on to see this sort of factional turmoil and a more orderly, but in fact in some ways more deadly phase of people being executed as counter-revolutionaries or for supposedly being involved in conspiracies, which in some cases we're told that, you know, these conspiracies are so sinister because they don't even know they're a part of it. So
let's talk about individual lives then, because this comes down, even in a country of 1.4 billion people, to individuals, as you've explained so articulately. You wrote the book through interviewing, and of course these people are now in their 50s or 60s who lived through it as teenage shock troops. What did they say about it? What were their recollections and how did they relive?
Well, of course, most people don't really want to talk about it. And what fascinated me was that there were these people who didn't necessarily want to talk about it, but I think felt they had to. And so it's a very mixed picture. There are people who still think the Cultural Revolution was right. And the only really thing that really went wrong with it was that it ended. And yes, there shouldn't have been so much violence, but Mao was quite right to sort of believe in this purity. There are also people who are deeply reflective about what they did. So I start the book really where I began in finding out about the Cultural Revolution with a painter called Xu Weixin, a wonderful painter who's done these immense sort of 2.5 metre tall portraits of people who died in the Cultural Revolution. And he told me that the first in the series, as far as he was concerned, was the very first picture he remembers drawing at the age of 7 or 8. He'd been told that his school teacher, who he'd liked very much, was actually the daughter of a landlord. And he was so shocked by his naivety in the moment that he had believed in this lovely woman that he drew this hideous caricature of her and pinned it up to the blackboard. And she walked in and saw it, and he says he just remembers her turning white because, of course, at that point, as a small child, he didn't really realise where it could lead. But even that early in the Cultural Revolution, it was very clear to her that it could mean disgrace, being ousted, and ultimately, of course, many teachers paid their price with their lives.
So that was a drawing, but you also went on to others who actively denounced teachers or were involved in violence.
Yes, absolutely, and who are now trying to reckon with that. And I think in many cases find it hard, even as they address it, perhaps to fully acknowledge everything or the full implications of what they did. I mean, they struggle with it very understandably. I think it would be easy for people perhaps to judge them. But I don't think any of us can imagine what it was like to be 13 or 14 years old, to have this man that you revered as a god telling you that it was your duty to see this chaos unfurl around you. And in many cases, I mean, one of the most striking things to me was my sort of first interviewee in the book, who was a young girl at the time, talking about how she felt at the time that she wasn't brave enough because she wasn't willing to beat teachers up. You know, she was attending these things, but she wasn't willing to attack them.
In the moment,
and she felt
that she didn't.
She felt it wasn't
right.
She felt it wasn't right, but there was also a part of her that was thinking, you know, should I be doing this? Why am I just not strong enough?
So if she didn't beat her teachers, why is she still obsessing about the Cultural Revolution now, revisiting it in her mind?
Because at that stage, even criticising a teacher could sort of open the door to so much worse. Being a red guard, seeing what was happening, going to struggle sessions. And I think as well the ambivalence, because in some ways for her it was a time of great freedom. She was a young teenage girl and she was travelling the country with her friends. She said in some ways at times it felt almost more like sightseeing or a holiday. And yet at the same time they also believed that they were on this revolutionary mission and it was their duty to bring the country to this kind of state of great ideological purity.
Because it's got not just the savage bloodbaths and the struggle sessions, but it's also got aspects of music festival and interrailing holiday and young people kind of having fun together.
Yeah, and it's very hard for us to imagine. And I think, as I said, very easy to judge. But I think it's just impossible for us to know what we would have done in those circumstances.
Well, and especially really difficult. I was just listening to you and thinking, how difficult would it be to try to re-explore the map of what was going on when there's no actual historical context that is freely available or discussed or processed as a society. You've got nowhere to kind of anchor yourself, have you, as you explore?
Exactly. And I think some of these people spoke out precisely because at the time I started writing, we were seeing a few more voices becoming evident, partly I think because of the internet. It was easier to share your story.
Yeah, I found that really interesting because I made a documentary series in 1996 on the 30th anniversary of the outbreak of the Cultural Revolution, which is obviously a pre-internet age. And then it was very interesting to me to read your interviews, which are slightly post the arrival of the internet.
Yes, I think there was that sense that people were more able to speak out and that was encouraging others. But also I think age, perhaps getting older and thinking about what had happened and wanting to record it, and that sense that it just wasn't anywhere there in society. So what sort of marks the people in the book out, I guess, are they are the ones who want to talk about it, whether because they believe that actually there are positive lessons to be learnt from the Cultural Revolution, as bizarre as that might sound to us. You know, they see it as a time when they were able to speak out in a way they couldn't now, and they see it as a time when there was greater respect for working people and less inequality and so forth. So I think in many cases as well, it's driven by their view of the present. Inevitably, part of the urge to speak out about what happened then is a sense of what the present is like and what it could be. And for people on the other side of the argument who see the Cultural Revolution as a warning, that's part of it too. They think, well, if we don't remember it, we may end up repeating it. And so for those reasons too, people want to keep it alive. And then for some people, it's so deeply personal. So in the case of the young man who denounced his mother, I mean, he was 17. He sent her to her death, he and his father, by revealing that she'd denounced Chairman Mao. And I don't think many of us could live with that knowledge. So to him, he wanted to keep that alive, to protect his mother's grave initially, and perhaps just to be true to his memory of her in a way that he hadn't been able to be true to her when she was alive.
Completely. I mean, to say something critical of Chairman Mao in those days was to do something that would definitely endanger your life.
It was suicidal. Yeah. I mean, because I think it's very hard for people to imagine the kind of things that could get you into trouble in those days. I mean, for example, people would sort of dutifully write down Chairman Mao quotes, but maybe they'd get a character wrong and someone would say, well, you did that on purpose. So even when you were trying to sort of do the right thing in their terms, or Lord, there were just these pitfalls all the way. I mean, it was an incredibly sort of treacherous terrain.
And that sense of absolute danger everywhere, in every relationship, in everywhere you went in life. And the sense, I suppose, just coming back to a point you were making earlier about the reasons why it happened and what Mao wanted to do, actually it took on a life of its own, didn't it? And all kinds of, unintended consequences as well as the intended consequences happened, to the extent that the revolution began to eat its own children. Perpetrators became victims, became perpetrators, rather, like in this family, and nobody knew how to navigate during that decade.
And so you just see a nation that's hugely traumatized still, and that struggles to come to terms with what people have done, what was done to them. In some cases, I think even really the sort of the rehabilitations that followed afterwards almost sort of made it worse, because there were people who sort of found a way to rationalise it by thinking, well, I must have done something wrong and I got it wrong. And then to discover after all that, of course, they hadn't. And it was just the zealotry, the paranoia of the moment was in a way almost sort of more devastating to them.